Imagine an event just exploding onto the world stage. Seems like it came out of nowhere. But you also feel it's been building for years, right, under the surface.
Yeah, exactly.
An event that doesn't just shake up one region, but sends tremors, really, through the whole international system.
Hmm.
That's what we're diving into today. We've got our hands on this really detailed analysis. It's a multi-domain report looking at the June 2025 conflict
Hmm.
between Iran and Israel.
And it's not just about the battles, the sort of kinetic stuff.
No, exactly. It digs much deeper. Regional power shifts, big strategic changes, and some, frankly, surprising global connections.
Things you wouldn't normally link together.
Right. So our mission here with this deep dive, it's to crack open this, pretty dense analysis and pull out the absolute crucial
And
insight.
the must-know stuff.
Yeah. The report actually calls this whole regional clash a kinetic manifestation of a fracturing global order. Big phrase.
It is.
And we want to help you understand what that actually means. We're taking all these complex layers from the source material, trying to distill it down.
So you can really grasp the key players, what's going on beneath the surface.
And maybe what it suggests about where things are headed.
And I think this analysis is, well, it's really compelling because it does go beyond just the headlines you might have seen.
Mm-hmm.
It looks hard at tactical failures, analyzes these big strategic shifts, and crucially connects this Middle East conflict to, well, broader, sometimes unexpected global dynamics.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It really does.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this, beginning with the conflict itself. For decades, Iran and Israel, it was mostly a shadow war, right?
That's the term, yeah. Proxies, covert ops.
Plausible deniability, all that. But in June 2025, according to this source, that just fundamentally changed.
It went overt.
Yeah.
Direct. No more shadows.
And the report points to Israel's actions, Operation Rising Lion, June 12th and 13th, 2025.
That's right. And the key thing here from the analysis is that this wasn't just hitting back in retaliation.
Not just tit for tat.
No, it's presented as a large-scale preemptive campaign.
Yeah.
Which suggests a really major shift in Israeli military thinking, their doctrine.
A shift away from what they used before.
Exactly. The report points out that their previous doctrine, deterrence, early warning that was judged inside Israel as having failed back in October 2023.
Right.
So this new approach outlined here, it's about preemptive dismantlement, trying to take threats apart before they can fully materialize.
Okay, preemptive dismantlement. That's the strategy. But how, operationally, how did Israel do this, according to the report?
Well, it details the methods,
Yeah.
talks about achieving strategic surprise.
Which is key in something like this.
Absolutely. Through this sophisticated mix, this fusion of intelligence and special operations. And one of the most striking details mentioned
Yeah.
is the use of pre-positioned assets.
Pre-positioned, meaning...
Meaning,
Yeah.
the analysis suggests that Israeli intelligence had, over a period of years, actually smuggled munitions, attack drones, things like that, into Iran itself.
Wow, inside the country.
Inside, setting up covert launch points. And the huge advantage there is bypassing Iran's quite layered air defenses,
Yeah.
striking from within.
That's a game changer, if true. Okay, so they launched from inside. What were they hitting? What were the targets?
The targets reflected this new doctrine, dismantling Iran's power pillars. The analysis indicates the main goals were crippling the foundations of their strategic capabilities.
Like what specifically?
Well, first, sites related to the nuclear program. The report calls the strikes on key facilities extremely effective, even severely damaging.
Yeah.
Places like Natanz, Kundab, Esfahan.
So a direct hit on the nuclear ambitions.
That was clearly a top priority. Second, missile capabilities. They hit ballistic missile bases, underground ones, surface sites all across Iran.
Trying to take out the launchers, the missiles themselves.
Damaging launchers, silos, stockpiles. The goal was clearly to degrade Iran's ability to launch its most powerful conventional weapons.
Okay, nuclear, missiles. What else?
Third pillar, leadership. The report describes a wide decapitation move.
Decapitation, taking out commanders.
Senior officers, yes, and also key scientists. People like Mohammad Mehdi Taranchi, Faridun Abbasi are mentioned. The aim, disrupt command, eliminate expertise, maybe force a kind of generational turnover.
Hitting the brain trust, essentially.
And finally, there were strikes on more conventional military assets and also energy infrastructure, cratering runways at air bases, hitting oil depots near Tehran.
So a really broad campaign. Israel makes this massive, seemingly quite successful preemptive move. How did Iran respond? The report contrasts their plan with what actually happened.
Right. Iran's doctrine, it often involves what they call active deterrence, relying on offensive actions using their proxies abroad.
Hmm.
The report suggests their war plan, involved a massive response, a huge firepower strike. They were apparently planning to launch up to 1,000 ballistic missiles.
1,000 to just overwhelm Israeli defenses.
That seems to have been the idea: saturation, just completely overwhelm systems like Iron Dome, David's Sling.
And here's a key point from the analysis, right? Those Israeli preemptive strikes threw a wrench in that plan.
A big one. They severely impacted Iran's ability to actually execute that massive launch. The report notes Iran only managed to get about 200 missiles and drones off the ground in total.
200 instead of 1,000. Huge difference.
Massive. And the outcome reflected that. There was some impact in Israel. The report mentions around 10 missile impacts in Tel Aviv. Casualties, sadly 1 death.
Okay, so some got through.
Some did. But critically, it was nothing like the overwhelming barrage they intended. It looked much more like their sort of limited probes back in 2024.
Then say that really effective attack they launched against Saudi Arabia in 2019.
Exactly. Not comparable in impact.
And there's another critical point the report makes about Iran's response, or lack thereof. Their proxies, the axis of resistance.
Yeah, this is highlighted as really significant. The surprising failure of that network, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, others, to intervene in a really meaningful way.
Why not? Weren't they supposed to be a key part of Iran's strategy?
They were. But the analysis argues that Israel's campaigns in the preceding years had systematically, quote, decimated groups like Hamas and clobbered Hezbollah.
Weaken them beforehand.
Severely weakened them. Effectively severing the link, the report argues, between Iran's conventional power and its asymmetric proxy network. The pillars were decoupled.
So if we look at the strategic balance sheet from this conflict as laid out in the analysis,
Yeah.
how does it stack up?
Well, for Israel, the report frames it as a tactical victory. They degraded key Iranian assets. They validated this new, more aggressive doctrine.
The preemptive dismantlement?
Right, and they showcased their air defense capabilities too. But, and it's a big but, the report notes this came at a high strategic cost.
That's us.
Potentially an open-ended war footing, definite strain on ties with the U.S., and crucially, the risk of actually pushing Iran harder towards getting nuclear weapons.
The opposite effect of what they might have intended with the nuclear site strikes.
Potentially, yes. For Iran, the analysis paints it as a significant strategic defeat. Their core assets were shown to be vulnerable, their leadership took hits, and that proxy network
Failed to deliver.
pretty much. The report does add, though, that Iran still keeps disruptive capacity. Think about this Strait of Hormuz, vital shipping lanes.
Yeah.
They can still cause trouble there.
Okay, so stepping back, what really strikes you about this sudden shift from decades of shadowboxing to just overt state-on-state war?
It's fascinating how quickly, according to this analysis, those unwritten rules just seem to dissolve. That whole complex, tense balance, the shadow war, it was replaced almost overnight by direct, attributable state action. The gloves came off completely.
And that kind of sudden fundamental shift, it's bound to have huge regional consequences, which this report gets into next.
Absolutely. This didn't happen in a vacuum. The analysis sees it as accelerating trends that were already underway in the Middle East.
Okay, so let's look at that reshaping of the region. The report talks quite a bit about Israel's apparent bid for regional primacy. Can you unpack that idea as it's presented?
Sure. The analysis suggests Israel has increasingly seen the big U.S. strategic shift, the pivot to Asia.
Which we'll get into more later.
Right. But they saw it not necessarily as a threat, like, oh, the U.S. is leaving us exposed. Instead, the report argues they saw it as a, quote, rare historical opportunity.
An opportunity? How so?
With the U.S. signaling it wants to reduce its direct military footprint, maybe delegate more, the report suggests Israel saw an opening to position itself as the primary security provider for an anti-Iran coalition.
Anchoring that coalition, especially with the Abraham Accords countries, UAE, Bahrain, maybe eventually Saudi Arabia.
That seems to be the idea presented. And Operation Rising Lion then becomes, in this interpretation, almost a demonstration, a sales pitch maybe?
A demonstration of what?
Of capability, military strength, intelligence reach, technological edge, cyber AI, advanced drones. The analysis suggests this display was meant to show they could anchor a new regional security setup.
One centered on Israel.
That could manage threats like Iran without needing, say, large numbers of U.S. troops permanently based there.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the Israeli angle. On the flip side, the report highlights the major strain this put on Iran's axis of resistance. Remind us what that term means in this context.
The axis of resistance, as the report describes it, is that network Iran built up. Non-state proxies, mostly, operating in various countries.
Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen.
Right. Militias in Iraq, Syria. The analysis notes this network was designed to project Iran's influence, give it strategic depth, and fight that asymmetric shadow war we mentioned.
And it worked. For a while.
Yeah, for a long time, it was actually pretty effective at challenging Iran's rivals, even though Iran's own conventional military had limitations.
So the big question the report raises is, why did it fall apart this time, during this direct conflict?
The answer given in this analysis is basically about scale and design. The model worked well for that lower-intensity, deniable shadow conflict.
But not for a full-on state war.
Exactly. It just wasn't designed or apparently capable of intervening effectively in a high-intensity, state-on-state fight, especially when, as the report details, key players like Hamas and Hezbollah had already been hit hard, weakened by Israel beforehand.
So the primary nodes were degraded.
And any secondary proxies that tried to get involved were just strategically marginal. They couldn't tip the balance in the main confrontation.
Okay. Let's shift gears to perhaps the biggest, most sobering consequence this report identifies, the nuclear question. There's a really provocative argument here.
There is. The report basically suggests that the very strikes Israel launched, aiming to dismantle Iran's nuclear program, they might have, ironically, counterintuitively, made a nuclear Iran more likely down the road.
How does that logic work?
Well, the analysis presents it from Tehran's perspective. The conflict showed them, quite brutally, that their conventional military deterrent wasn't enough.
It failed.
And their proxy network couldn't shield them from a direct, large-scale attack on their homeland. So the analysis suggests this strengthens the argument of those inside the Iranian leadership.
The hardliners.
Potentially, those who argue that only having a nuclear weapon, a bomb, can truly guarantee the regime's survival against a technologically superior adversary like Israel.
So the attack meant to prevent the bomb might actually accelerate the path to the bomb.
That's the paradox the report highlights. Now, what about Israel's side of this? The report mentions their nuclear posture, the Samson option, their policy of amimut, opacity.
Right. What's the connection there?
Well, the analysis discusses Israel's nuclear stance, including that reported Samson option, the idea they might use nukes as a last resort if facing an existential threat.
Which they hope never happens, obviously.
Of course. And the report presents Israeli first use in this specific 2025 scenario as low probability. But it argues the scale and directness of the conflict, it pushes the whole confrontation closer to that potential existential threshold for Israel.
It raises the stakes to a level where nuclear thinking, even if deterrent, becomes more prominent.
Potentially, yes, even under their long-held policy of amimut, that deliberate ambiguity about their own nuclear capabilities. The directness of the conflict brings those ultimate questions closer to the surface.
What really stands out here is how the report argues this conflict basically blew up strategic ambiguity.
Yeah.
Those unwritten rules, the red lines of the shadow war, which weirdly provided a kind of tense stability.
Exactly. Now, the analysis suggests everything is direct, attributable, public. Those buffers are gone, and that creates a much more volatile potential for rapid escalation.
A much more dangerous situation, arguably.
The analysis certainly seems to imply that. Losing that old, uncomfortable equilibrium is presented as one of the most dangerous takeaways.
And this volatility, this danger, it doesn't just stay contained in the Middle East, does it? This report zooms way out, arguing this crisis isn't isolated at all. It directly challenges a core element of U.S. grand strategy.
The pivot to Asia.
Exactly. Explain that connection.
The report points out that the pivot, or rebalance, to Asia, this strategy the U.S. has broadly pursued since around 2011. It's all about shifting America's primary foreign policy focus, its military weight, away from the Middle East and towards the big geopolitical challenge, China in the Indo-Pacific.
Focusing on the main competitor.
Right. But the analysis kind of describes the last decade or so as a lost decade for that pivot. Why? Because these persistent crises, these commitments in the Middle East, they kept pulling U.S. attention and resources right back.
Getting dragged back in.
Constantly.
So how did this specific June 2025 conflict derail the pivot, according to the report? What was the impact?
Well, the report details a significant resource drain across the board. First, high-level diplomatic focus. Top officials in Washington consumed by Mideast crisis management.
Taking time away from Asia.
Precisely. Then, Critical military assets, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, ISR platforms, they have to be diverted to monitor the Middle East.
Stuff that could be watching the South China Sea, for example.
Exactly. You've got a major U.S. naval presence under CENICOM tied up in the region, pulling ships and crews away from Indo-PACOM. And then there's the industrial base issue.
The factories building the weapons.
Yeah. The U.S. Defense Industrial Base was already strained, supporting Ukraine, for instance. This report notes the Mideast crisis adds huge pressure. It forces tough choices about finite systems, things like advanced missile interceptors.
Interceptors needed both for Israel and potentially for partners like Taiwan.
Exactly. You can't easily surge production overnight. The analysis also points out that this kind of forced intervention just runs counter to the stated U.S. goal of reducing Mideast entanglements.
It contradicts the whole idea of the pivot. Now, the report mentions burden shifting as part of the theory behind the pivot. Explain that.
Yeah, burden shifting is basically the idea that key U.S. allies in a region can take on more responsibility for managing local threats themselves.
So in the Mideast, letting Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE handle Iran more directly.
That's the concept. Lifting that burden from the U.S., freeing up American resources, attention, bandwidth, to focus on the bigger strategic priorities, namely China.
Sounds logical on paper, but the report argues there's a fundamental flaw.
It does. The analysis highlights what it sees as the core problem. When you shift the burden, you inevitably give up some control over escalation.
How so?
Well, empowering allies to manage threats also empowers them to potentially start things, to initiate actions or conflicts that the U.S. might not actually want.
But then can't ignore.
Exactly. Because of alliances, interests, regional stability concerns. The report frames Israel's Operation Rising Lion as precisely this kind of move one the U.S., quote, saw coming but couldn't stop.
Forcing the U.S. into reacting rather than setting its own agenda.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Forced into a reactive posture, scrambling to manage a crisis instead of proactively focusing its strategy on Asia.
And this dynamic leads to what the report calls the pivot's paradox. Walk us through this idea. It sounds important.
It is. The report describes it as this kind of self-defeating cycle, a loop. So step one, the U.S. tries to reduce its involvement in the Middle East to concentrate on China in Asia. The pivot,
Step two.
that attempt to withdraw, or just lower the profile, creates a perception of a power vacuum in the Middle East, or at least makes regional actors feel they need to be more proactive.
So they step up, like Israel did, according to this analysis.
Exactly. Regional actors take more assertive, maybe unilateral actions to secure their own interests. Step three, these actions then ignite a major regional conflict.
Like the June 2025 war.
Step four, that war then sucks up the very resources, diplomatic energy, military assets, industrial capacity, that the U.S. intended to shift to Asia for the pivot.
Ah, so the act of trying to pivot away.
Creates the conditions that make the pivot impossible. That's the paradox.
Wow. So this central unresolved contradiction sits right at the heart of U.S. strategy, according to this analysis.
That's the argument presented.
And it means that events that seem purely regional, like in the Middle East, are actually deeply tied up with America's biggest global challenge, the competition with China.
Exactly. And the analysis doesn't stop there. It goes even deeper, looking beyond the overt military stuff
Okay.
to explore other, more subtle theaters of rivalry that it identifies as being relevant to this whole picture.
This is where it gets really unexpected, right? The report brings up the rivalry between the City of London and Wall Street. How on earth does that connect to a war in the Middle East?
It seems like a stretch at first, I know. But the analysis makes the case this way. A nation's foreign policy, it argues, is often deeply influenced by its core economic interests.
Okay, makes sense.
For the UK, the health, the global standing of the City of London Financial Centre is absolutely paramount. National interest.
Sure.
The report notes that since Brexit, the city has faced, well, some headwinds. Slower growth compared to rivals, financial services exports haven't boomed, maybe concerns about attracting big company listings.
It mentions a UK tech firm listing in New York in 2025.
Yeah, highlights that as an example.
Yeah.
This whole situation, the report suggests, just intensifies the competitive pressure, the rivalry with Wall Street.
Okay, so there's economic competition. How does that drive UK foreign policy in a new direction?
The argument in the analysis is that with its traditional role as the main gateway to the EU markets diminished.
Post-Brexit.
Right. The city needs to aggressively find new markets, attract capital flows from outside the traditional U.S.-dominated Western financial system.
look elsewhere for growth.
Exactly. And this creates a powerful economic incentive for the UK government to pursue foreign policy goals that might diverge from Washington's preferences,
Yeah.
if those goals could potentially unlock lucrative financial ties elsewhere.
Okay, I see the logic. Now, the report uses this very provocative phrase, an Anglo-Sino axis of convenience. But it's careful here, right?
Very careful. It explicitly states there's no evidence of some coordinated plot. Let's be clear on that.
Okay, no conspiracy.
No. Instead, it focuses on how their parallel interests might converge, unintentionally perhaps, in ways that affect global dynamics.
What are those parallel interests, according to the report?
Well, for the UK, driven by the city's needs, it's pragmatically courting Chinese capital and financial business. The report mentions talks in early 2025 about expanding things like Stock Connect, Wealth Connect.
Ways to link UK and Chinese markets.
Right, and promoting London as a hub for trading in China's currency, the renminbi. That serves the city's interests.
And China's interests.
China's grand strategy, the analysis states, involves gradually eroding U.S. global dominance, pushing for a more multipolar world. And a key tactic is diverting U.S. attention and resources away from the Indo-Pacific, away from China's neighborhood.
Okay, so a Mideast crisis, like the one in June 2025, how does that serve both of these interests, even if unintentionally?
That's the core idea presented. For China, a Mideast crisis is good because it bogs the U.S. down, consumes American bandwidth, attention, resources,
Right.
distracts from Asia.
Checks that box for Beijing. And for the UK?
For the UK, the crisis creates global uncertainty, market volatility, potential capital flight. The analysis suggests that a city of London, perceived as maybe more independent post-Brexit, with its own regulations and strengthening non-Western financial links,
Could position itself as a safe haven?
could try to attract some of those nervous global funds, which benefits the UK economy, the city. So again, the report frames it not as collusion, but as this convergence. UK economic strategy and Chinese anti-US strategy finding common ground in a distracted America.
Fascinating, if unsettling. Okay, let's shift to another theater the report discusses.
Yeah.
The Himalayas. India and China.
Right. The analysis looks at the U.S. strategy of building up India as a potential counterweight to China's power in Asia.
And the U.S. has invested a lot in that relationship.
Quite a bit, according to the report. Deepening defense cooperation, offering advanced military tech F-35s, are mentioned, co-production of things like Stryker vehicles, intelligence sharing, support related to the border dispute with China.
Building India up as a partner against China, but the analysis says it's too simple to think the U.S. can just trigger a conflict there.
Yeah, it pushes back against that simple idea. It notes India's strong tradition of strategic autonomy, making its own decisions. And importantly, India has complex, often very close, economic ties with China, too.
It mentions that brief warming of relations between India and China in 2024 that worried Washington.
It does, and the report argues that kind of rapprochement, a stable Sino-Indian relationship, actually threatens the U.S. strategy. Because if India and China are getting along, India is neutralized as a counterweight.
So the U.S. has an incentive to keep things tense.
That's the argument presented in the analysis. It suggests this creates an incentive for the U.S. to ensure that friction, that potential for conflict along the India-China border remains high.
How does it do that?
The report frames U.S. policy not as trying to start a war, but as escalation enablement.
Escalation enablement,
Meaning providing India with advanced capabilities, political backing, intelligence support, all designed to lower New Delhi's perceived risk if a confrontation does happen, make them feel more confident, perhaps more willing to push back against China.
So not lighting the fire, but keeping the tinder dry and maybe handing out matches?
That's a decent analogy for the report's argument. Keeping the potential for conflict in the Himalayas ripe so that if a skirmish occurs, it could potentially escalate and bog China down, absorbing its focus and resources away from other areas.
The report's conclusion here is basically that the U.S. goal is to ensure the Himalayan tinderbox stays ready to ignite as a way to distract its main rival if needed.
Yes, that's the essence of that part of the analysis.
Okay. We have covered a lot of ground here, really digging into this report. From the tactical details of the June 2025 fighting,
Operation Rising Lion, the missile exchanges.
to the reshaping of the whole Middle East power balance, the huge challenge this poses to core U.S. strategy with the pivot paradox, and these unexpected deep connections to global financial rivalries, London versus Wall Street, and even distant border tensions in the Himalayas.
It really paints a picture where this Mideast event isn't just regional. It's profoundly tied into these much bigger global shifts, strategic problems, underlying economic currents.
So, pulling it all together, what are the key trajectories the report sees going forward, say the next 5 years, 2025 to 2030?
Well, it points to a few key things. First, an intensified, probably more volatile shadow war continuing in the Middle East, but maybe with a lower threshold now for direct state-on-state action.
The buffers are gone.
Right. Second, a real reckoning for the U.S. with that pivot paradox. They have to figure out how to square that circle, or if they even can.
A major strategic headache.
Definitely. Third, potentially a widening strategic divergence between the U.S. and the U.K., partly driven by those post-Brexit economic factors we discussed.
Competing interests.
And fourth, continued tension between China and India in the Himalayas, possibly made more likely, or at least kept simmering, by external policies aimed at using that friction for containment.
Okay, so what does all this mean for you, the listener, trying to process this really complex picture? The report has policy ideas, sure, but for our deep dive today, what's the big takeaway?
I think the crucial takeaway is just how interconnected everything actually is. Things that seem distant, unrelated,
Yeah.
they often aren't.
Yeah. The conflict in June 2025, it wasn't just about Iran and Israel in isolation. This analysis frames it as both a symptom of these larger global forces already in motion.
And a catalyst for them, accelerating shifts in power, strategy, economics.
Which leaves us maybe with a final thought, a question for you to mull over.
Yeah, something to consider. As these major global powers like the U.S. try to shift their focus, and as regional players like Israel or Iran or India increasingly assert their own interests, sometimes quite unilaterally, is the whole world system becoming inherently less stable? Does this individual pursuit of what each nation sees as its own self-interest, even if there aren't grand conspiracies or plots, does it just make the global system more prone to these kinds of unexpected, dangerous, interconnected crises?
A really sobering question, something to definitely keep thinking about. Keep watching these connections because, according to this analysis, they're only going to become more important.
Indeed.
That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.